The bees found him before he found them. That is what he would think about, standing there in the gray of a November morning, with frost still caught in the grass between the old apple rows. 3 battered wooden hive boxes sat at his feet, like luggage from somewhere far away, their painted surfaces cracked and weather-stained, the wood soft at the corners where seasons had worked against the joints. Around him, slow spiraling lines of bees turned in the cold air, not the frantic cloud of summer, but a quieter, probing kind of flight, as if the colonies were reading the place, taking stock of the bare branches overhead and the pale sky beyond them, and the old man standing very still at the center of it all. The truck was gone. He had watched it go. The man from 2 counties over had climbed up into the cab with the easy comfort of someone claiming something already his, turned the engine once, and pulled down the county road without looking back. The 1974 Ford, dark green, rusted low along the doors. The truck he had used to haul feed and fence posts, and the occasional load of brush for nearly a decade, had simply become someone else's truck. That was the whole of the transaction. 3 hives for 1 vehicle. No paperwork beyond a handshake, and a bill of sale written on the back of a fuel receipt. Now the road was empty, and the orchard was quiet, except for the wind moving through bare branches, and the low, even hum rising from the boxes at his feet. He did not find the hum unsettling. That was the thing he would have had difficulty explaining to anyone in the valley, had any of them been standing beside him, which they were not, and would not have been even if invited, because by the morning of this trade the story had already made its circuit through the feed store, and the diner, and the neighboring farms, and come back around to him as laughter. He had heard it second-hand from the feed store owner, who had not bothered to disguise his amusement. He had heard it from the auctioneer, who had valued the truck the previous spring, and seemed personally offended that it had gone for 3 boxes of what he called a swarm of trouble. He had heard it loudest, though without a single word, from the neighboring farmer who ran the larger operation 2 fields over, a man who had simply stood at his fence line the morning the hive boxes arrived on the flatbed, watched the whole proceeding with his arms crossed, and eventually turned back toward his own barn, shaking his head, in the slow, deliberate way of someone making a point to no one in particular. The old man had let all of it arrive and pass through him the way he had learned to let cold air pass through a worn jacket. You feel it, you note it, you keep moving. He crouched now beside the nearest hive box, one knee close to the frosted ground, and watched a single bee trace a slow arc outward from the entrance, pause in the air as if uncertain, then circle back. The orchard stretched in every direction around him, bare, quiet, and waiting. He put one hand lightly on the wood of the hive. He had placed his hand on the wood of the hive and held it there until the cold of the morning moved through his palm and into the bones beneath. And it was that cold, the particular cold of late November in the valley, that carried him backward through time, the way cold always did. Not with drama, just with the quiet insistence of a season that had been before and would be again. He had first walked those rows in early October, 6 weeks before the flatbed arrived with the 3 hive boxes. He had walked them the way a man walks the ward of a hospital, slowly, without rushing the truth, counting what was there and what was not. The trees were alive. That was not the question. Their bark held color, their branches reached, their roots still drew from whatever the valley's water table had to offer. But alive and fruitful are 2 different things, and the orchard had spent 3 years making that distinction plain. He counted. He had always counted, when the feeling threatened to become too large. It was a habit from another life. Inventory before despair, facts before conclusions. The apple trees in the north row should have carried 400 bushels between them in a good year. His late wife's father had proven that number, written it in a ledger the old man still kept in the kitchen drawer. The ink faded to the color of dried grass. In that October he counted fewer than 60 apples across those same trees. 40 of them were small, undersized, the kind that the market owner would have turned away without apology. The pear trees were worse. He stood at the edge of the south row for a long time, without counting anything at all. The orchard had not always been his. It had been her father's first, a man he had known only in the last years of the old farmer's life. A quiet man, with large hands and an unhurried way of explaining things, who had planted the first stock here, before the veteran had ever returned from anywhere. The trees had been established before the wedding, before the farmhouse had its kitchen addition, before any of the life the old man thought of now as the fixed stars of his existence. Her father had chosen the varieties with the patience of someone who understood he was building for time rather than for himself. He had grafted rootstock with the care of a craftsman. He had planted windbreaks. He had done the work of imagining a future he expected others to inhabit. The old man had inherited that imagination, along with the deed, and for 20 years, the orchard had honored it. It had given abundantly, reliably, with the kind of steady generosity that quietly becomes invisible because it is always there. They had sold at the county market, filled the root cellar, given crates to neighbors, pressed cider in the fall. The trees had been part of every year, in the way weather was part of every year. Present, various, sustaining. Then the pollinators thinned, then disappeared. Then the blossoms came and went without consequence, flowers performing their ancient offer to a world that no longer answered. 3 seasons of silence in trees that had never learned how to stop trying. He walked out of the rows and stood at the edge of the field, looking back. The feed store was where it started, the way most things started in that valley, not with intention, but with a slow accumulation of pieces that someone eventually assembled into a story. The man who ran the store had a gift for this. He did not gossip in the obvious way, did not lean across the counter and whisper. He simply mentioned things in sequence, in a tone of mild bewilderment, and let the people standing in his aisles do the rest. He had heard it from the auctioneer, who had heard it from a man 2 counties over, who had been present at the trade itself. The old man's dark green Ford, the '74 F100 with the rust along the lower doors that everyone in the valley recognized on sight, had been driven away by a stranger. In its place, loaded into the bed of a borrowed truck and carried back to the orchard, were 3 beehives, not good beehives, not the kind a man with sense would choose. Wild colonies, feral mixed, given up by a keeper who had tried to work them and decided the trouble wasn't worth the honey. Aggressive, unpredictable, the kind that made experienced men step back. The auctioneer heard the description of those hives and shook his head with the authority of a man who had priced the truck himself not 2 years prior. He knew what that Ford was worth. It was the kind of vehicle that ran because it was simple enough that it had no choice, no complexity to fail, nothing modern to give out. It was transportation that cost nothing but patience. He said so, more than once, to anyone who stood still long enough to hear it. The neighboring farmer, the one whose land ran along the east edge of the old man's property, whose operation was larger and newer, and whose opinion arrived in every conversation, whether invited or not, heard the story at the feed store on a Tuesday, and laughed the first time as a reflex, the way a man does when something is too strange to take seriously. But then he told it again that evening, and again it was funny, and by the third telling, it had become the kind of story a community holds on to because it confirms something it already wanted to believe. What it confirmed was this: the old man had finally lost the thread, not in the dramatic way that made people uncomfortable, but in the gentle, almost forgivable way that the valley had come to expect from someone who had been struggling too long, without enough to show for it. He was sentimental about the orchard. Everyone knew that. Sentiment was fine in its place, but sentiment did not justify trading your only reliable transportation for a problem 3 counties couldn't solve. A man without a truck in that valley was a man who had removed himself from the practical world. The tools, the feed, the market, the parts counter, all of it required a truck. You could limp along without money for a season. You could not limp along without wheels. The laughter was not cruel at its start. It was the laughter of people who believed they were watching a man make himself smaller, and who felt, in some part of themselves they would not have named, a complicated relief that it was not them standing at the edge of that failing orchard, making that particular trade. He left before first light on the day of the trade, the orchard still dark behind him, the trees standing in their rows like men waiting for orders that had not yet come. The truck started on the second try, the way it always did in cold weather, and he sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel and let the engine settle into its rhythm. The cab smelled of motor oil and old leather, and something faintly mineral that had always been there, absorbed into the seat over decades of use. He did not look back at the orchard when he pulled out. He had already made the decision, and he was not the kind of man who undid decisions by looking backward at them. The drive was 2 counties over, 2 hours on roads that ran through country very much like his own, fields that had been cut and left to wait, fence lines running toward horizons, farmhouses set back from the road with their particular expressions of endurance. The valley gave way to other valleys. The truck ran steady. He drove with the window cracked, because he had always preferred the cold coming in over the sealed-up smell of a heated cab, and the air came through sharp and clean with the last of the season still in it. The man giving up the hives was younger, impatient-looking, with the manner of someone who had already mentally moved on from this particular problem and wanted the transaction to confirm that. He showed the veteran the 3 hives set along the back fence of a weedy half-acre. Wooden boxes, weathered gray, with a restless energy coming off them, even in the cold, that told you immediately these were not docile colonies. 2 of the hives had bees moving at the entrance boards despite the temperature, which should not have been happening, and which the younger man pointed out as evidence of the problem rather than as any kind of quality. He called them difficult. He used the word unmanageable twice. The veteran stood in front of the middle hive for a long moment without speaking. The sound coming out of it was low and complex, and not entirely unlike the sound of a thing that has been compressed too long and is looking for a direction to move. He had heard sounds like that before, in other contexts, in other decades of his life. He recognized what lived inside it. Not anger exactly, pressure, vitality, with nowhere useful to go yet. He said he would take them. The keys changed hands in the driveway. The younger man did not linger over it. A neighbor of the younger man drove the borrowed flatbed, and they loaded the 3 hives in the gray afternoon light, moving carefully, speaking very little. When the hives were secured and the truck was gone, already someone else's, the veteran climbed into the passenger seat of the flatbed and watched the property recede through the side window. The road home was long. The sky over the fields had gone the color of old pewter, flat and even and without drama. Behind them in the flatbed bed, the 3 hives hummed, not loudly, but constantly, a sound like something waking up slowly and taking stock of where it was. He rode with his hands folded in his lap and listened. The flatbed turned off the county road just before dark, and they unloaded the hives by lantern light, slowly, without rushing, setting each one down on the flat ground between the oldest rows of apple trees where the soil was level and the windbreak of the tree line lay to the north. He had picked the spot weeks before he ever made the trade, standing out there on an October morning with his hands in his pockets and his breath showing in the cold, reading the way the early light came through the bare branches. Not enough sun too early, not too much exposure. A place where foragers could come and go without fighting the wind. He had stood there a long time before he was satisfied. Now, the hives sat on that ground, and the lantern threw long shadows across the rows. and the trees stood around them like something that had not yet decided what to think. The younger man and his neighbor left without ceremony. The sound of the flatbed faded down the road, and then there was just the orchard, and the dark, and the low, patient hum coming from the 3 boxes on the ground. He did not go inside right away. He stood at the edge of the hive placement and listened for a while, until the cold drove him back to the house. In the days that followed, he wore a veil, and his leather work gloves, and nothing else over his ordinary clothes. That was a choice, not an oversight. A full suit tells the bees nothing about you. It makes you a sealed, anonymous shape, a wall, a threat, without a smell or a temperature or a history. He had read enough and thought enough about it to believe that patience worked better than armor, at least eventually, and that the stings were simply the cost of introduction. They stung him! Each hive had its own particular disposition, the way dogs in a yard do. One colony quick and decisive, another slower to rouse but harder to settle once it was, the third strange and watchful, taking longer to react but stinging with a peculiar precision, finding the edges of the veil, the thin places at the wrist. He kept count of the stings for the first week, then stopped counting. The swelling on his forearms was a kind of record he carried in his skin. The orchard gave him nothing to look at during those weeks. The branches were bare, had been bare since early October, and they held the pale November light with the particular indifference of things that were alive but had given up on expressing it for the season. The ground had gone hard. Frost came at night, and the mornings smelled of iron and old wood. He moved through the rows with the slow, deliberate economy of a man accustomed to moving through terrain that offered no comfort, checking frames, watching the clusters form inside the boxes against the cold, learning which colony conserved and which spent. He did not tell himself it was going well. He did not tell himself anything. He simply came back out the next morning, and the morning after that, and the colonies slowly began to register that he was not a threat, that he was a consistent presence, a weather pattern, something the landscape now contained. December came in without ceremony. One morning the temperature simply did not recover after dawn, and by afternoon the first ice storm had moved through the valley and left everything sealed under a thin, bright crust that caught the flat winter light and threw it back, like a mirror no one had asked for. The orchard stood encased. Every twig, every dormant bud, every strand of old wire on the fence posts, all of it glazed and motionless. It was beautiful in the way that indifferent things sometimes are. He stood at the kitchen window with his coffee going cold in his hand and looked at it for a long moment, then set the cup down and went to get his coat. His knees had been bad since before he could honestly remember when they started. Cold made them a different kind of bad, a grinding, deliberate ache that lived in the bone rather than the tissue, the kind that announced itself on the first step of every morning and did not improve much from there. He did not mention this to anyone because there was no one to mention it to. He simply moved the way a man moves when pain is a condition of the day rather than an interruption of it, carefully, without complaint, conserving momentum where he could. He had wrapped the hives before the first hard freeze, layering them in burlap he had salvaged from old feed sacks. Then a second layer of roofing felt tacked at the corners with small staples, leaving the entrance reducers open, just enough for the cluster to breathe. He checked them now, not by opening them, that would break the seal of warmth the bees had built inside the boxes, but by pressing a bare hand to the side of each hive and feeling for the faint vibration of the winter cluster, that slow collective hum that meant life was still organized inside the cold, still choosing to hold together. All 3 hives hummed. He stood in the silence of the glazed orchard and listened to each one in turn. When stores ran low, which he could judge by the lightness of the boxes, when he gently tilted them on their stands, he mixed sugar syrup and set it in the top feeders, working quickly and closing them back, before the cold could reach the cluster. He did this on mornings when the temperature sat just at the edge of what was manageable, and he did it on mornings when it sat well below that edge, and the distinction between the two became less important over time. What he noticed, and he noticed it the way a man notices weather rather than feeling, as information rather than comfort, was that he had stopped treating the daily walk to the hives as a task. It had become something else. The half-mile across the frozen ground, his boots leaving prints in the stiff grass, the gray silence of the orchard around the 3 wrapped boxes, it had acquired a quality he did not have a ready word for, not peace, not quite purpose. Something closer to the particular steadiness of a man who has found the one thing in a difficult season that still requires him to show up. He stayed beside them longer than the work demanded. The land did not feel abandoned. That was all he knew, and for now, it was enough. February came in with a sound like water. Not rain, just the particular loosening that happens when a cold that has held for weeks finally releases its grip by degrees. The creek at the bottom of the property running audible again for the first time since December. The frozen ruts in the lane softening enough to give slightly underfoot. It was not spring. It was not even a promise of spring. It was simply a pause in the hardness, the season breathing through its teeth. He was out early, as he always was, and he noticed the change before he reached the hives. The air had a different quality at the tree line. Not warm, but without the edge that had made the morning walks feel like walking into something. He slowed when he was still 20 feet out. One of the hives, the middle one, was showing movement at the entrance board. Small movement. A single bee, then 2, then a third, emerging into the gray mid-morning light, with what looked like uncertainty, the careful, testing quality of something that is not yet sure the world is ready for it. He stopped. He did not step closer. He stood in the mud, with his hands loose at his sides, and he watched. The scouts circled low at first, staying close to the box, and then one of them lifted and moved toward the nearest row of apple trees. He tracked it with his eyes, without turning his head. It flew the length of the row, low along the dormant branches, and came back. Then it went again, a slightly different line. The other 2 moved in wider arcs, mapping something. He did not know if what he was watching could fairly be called scouting in any technical sense, but that was what it looked like. The careful work of small things sent out to read a world their colony had not touched in months. He stayed still for the better part of an hour. The mud was cold through his boot soles. He did not notice. He was watching the way the bees moved relative to the trees, which rows they crossed and which they did not, how far from the hives the arcs extended, where they seemed to double back. He had no instrument for this. He had no chart. He had his eyes and his patience, and a lifetime of reading things that communicated slowly and did not repeat themselves. When the cold returned in the early afternoon, a light wind coming back through the valley, the thaw already pulling back, the bees withdrew, and the entrance board went still. He stood another few minutes after the last one disappeared, then turned and walked back to the house. That evening, after supper, he went out again with a lantern and his pry bar. He adjusted the entrance reducer on the middle hive, widening it by a thumb's width. Then he crouched beside the eastern hive, the one that had always been the quietest, the one whose colony he understood least, and he shifted it, 3 feet to the left, no more. He settled it level, checked the stand, and stood back. He did not explain this to himself in words. He just moved the thing to where it needed to be. The lantern light fell across the orchard in a pale ring around him, and beyond it the trees stood in the dark, still and full of waiting. March came in without announcement. There was no dramatic thaw, no single morning when everything changed. It arrived the way most real things arrive, gradually, with small signs that meant nothing alone and everything together. The mud deepened along the south fence. The nights lost their absolute silence, and gained instead a faint drip from the barn eave. And then one morning, on the oldest pear tree at the far edge of the orchard, a single branch opened. He saw it from across the field. He was carrying water to the hives, same as every morning, and he stopped walking when the white caught his eye. He stood there with the bucket in his hand for a long moment before he set it down in the frozen grass and walked toward the tree. The blossoms were small, just opened, pale as cream at the edge of the petals. He counted perhaps 11 flowers on that one branch. He did not touch them. He only stood beneath the crown and looked up through the bare branches at the gray-white sky and the small bright cluster of white against it. By the next morning, 2 more branches had opened on the same tree. By the end of that week, the whole crown was in flower. The bees found it on the second day. He heard them before he saw them, a low thread of sound winding through the cold air, thin at first, barely there, and then fuller as more foragers came off the hive boards and climbed into the morning. He watched them rise from the 3 hives in loose lines and veer without hesitation toward the pear tree. They had known before he did. They had been waiting for exactly this, holding that knowledge in their bodies through the entire winter, and now they moved with the certainty of things that do not second-guess. Within a week, the first apple trees began to show color at their tips. Then the next row. Then the row beyond that. He walked the orchard in the mornings without speaking, stopping at each tree to look up into the branches, watching the blossoms open in sequence, the way they always had decades ago, when the valley still held enough wild colonies to do the work. Now there were 3 hives at the center of it all, expanded over winter, stronger than they had been in autumn, and the sound they made moving through the trees was not loud. It was constant, a low, continuous working that filled the rows from one end to the other. The orchard had a voice again. He had not realized how completely he had missed that sound until it came back. He stopped between 2 of the oldest apple trees on a Tuesday morning, both of them covered now in blossoms, the air around them busy and purposeful, and he just stood there with his hands at his sides and let it wash over him. He had not planted a single flower. He had only given the orchard what it needed to remember how to do this itself. The blossoms held through May. He had watched enough seasons to know that a heavy bloom was not yet a harvest. Late frost could still come. A wet week could bring rot. The blossoms could fall without setting, and so he did not allow himself to feel the thing he was beginning to feel. He kept his mornings methodical. He checked the hives at first light. He walked the rows. He repaired a section of old fence along the eastern edge that had been leaning since the previous autumn. He kept his hands occupied and his expectations low, and let the orchard proceed at its own pace without interference. But the fruit set, not in isolated clusters the way it had in years when the trees were trying and failing, producing a handful of small, hard apples along one row while the others stayed bare. It set across the whole orchard in a way he had not seen in more than 10 years, unevenly at first, then with a steadiness that became unmistakable by June, and by midsummer there was no longer any way to describe it as anything other than abundance. The branches were bending. He walked the rows in the long evening light and had to reach up and thin clusters by hand so the weight would not split the older limbs. It was the kind of work he had not done since his wife was alive. He had not expected to do it again. The neighboring farmer drove the county road that ran along the western fence line on a Wednesday afternoon in late July. The veteran heard the truck slow, the particular sound of an engine dropping speed, and looked up from where he was working near the fence. The truck stopped, the engine idled. Through the fence posts and the hanging fruit, he could see the man sitting behind the wheel, not moving, just looking at the rows of apple and pear trees bent under the weight of what was coming. He looked for a long moment. Then he drove on, without a word. The veteran watched him go. Then he turned back to his work. The note from the county market owner arrived in the first week of August, folded into an envelope, addressed in handwriting the veteran recognized from market receipts over the years. It was brief and careful. the way a man writes when he is asking for something he was not expecting to ask for. It inquired about availability for the fall market. It mentioned that space could be arranged if the crop was what it appeared to be from the road. It did not reference anything that had been said during the winter. The veteran read it twice at the kitchen table, then set it down next to his coffee cup and looked out the window at the orchard. The trees were heavy and green in the August heat. The hives were working. He had known since spring what the fall would look like. He folded the note, set it on the shelf below the flag, and went back outside to finish what he'd started. The morning he loaded the wagon, the frost had not yet lifted from the grass. He worked by lantern light at first, moving the crates from the barn floor to the wagon bed in careful stacks, each one settled against the next, the way a man handles something he has waited a long time to carry. The apples were heavy and cold and clean-smelling in the dark, and the pears had come in better than any he remembered in recent years, their skins smooth and faintly warm-colored, even in the lantern glow. He had borrowed the flatbed from a man 2 farms north, who had offered it without being asked for much, just a quiet mention that it would be available if needed. He hitched a ride out to collect it the evening before and drove it back slow, parking it in the yard and spending the better part of an hour loading crates by hand while the night settled in around him. He walked to the market. The wagon rolled behind him on the county road, with the kind of sound that belongs to early autumn mornings, the wooden wheels steady on the packed gravel, the load balanced and calm. The flatbed followed behind, driven by the same neighbor who had lent it. They did not talk much. There was not much that needed saying. The market lot was already filling when they arrived. The veteran unloaded without hurrying. He set the crates in 2 rows on the table he had reserved and stood back and looked at them once, the way a man looks at work that is finished and does not need explaining. By mid-morning, the crates were moving. By midday, they were gone. He saw the men who had spent the winter laughing. They were standing in the lot, in the way men stand when they have come to see something and found it already settled. The neighboring farmer was among them, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at the empty table with an expression that had no easy name. The feed store owner was nearby. Nobody said anything that reached across the distance. The veteran did not look at them long. He folded the money at the table, smoothed each bill once, and tucked the fold into the breast pocket of his worn denim jacket. Then he thanked the neighbor, helped load the empty crates, and rode back without ceremony. That evening, he moved the hives. 3 had become 4 over the winter, the 4th built from salvaged lumber in the cold months, fit together carefully in the barn while the season turned. He carried each one deeper into the orchard as the light went low, setting them between the oldest rows of apple trees where the ground was level and the air held warmth longest after sunset. The orchard was quiet. The trees stood full and darkening in the dusk, their branches still carrying the memory of what had grown there. The hives settled into the grass like they had always belonged. He walked back to the house. The land went on without him, unhurried and full, quietly right.